Okay, so we'll just start out with the first question. Dahlia, do you want to ask the first question?
Sure. We'll start out with what is your name? And
My
then
name is Sheri Castle.
awesome. And what is your profession? And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, if we were to just meet in casual conversation, like sitting next to each other on a plane or something, I would say that I'm a writer. But to be a little more specific, I'm a food writer, which means I don't do things like restaurant reviews. I write about food and cooking and different topics related to food. I also teach cooking classes. I do some media work like for public radio and public television. And I also develop recipes for home cooks and for various food companies.
Awesome.
What a great profession to have. Thank you for telling us about that. So, what does storytelling and more specifically food storytelling mean to you?
Well, to me, a story is when you give context to something rather than just stating a fact. It's when you add, is it a context or an experience or something that makes it a narrative instead of just a statement of fact. Not that there aren't facts in stories, but it's what the difference between like data and context. And so when I talk about, telling storytelling about food, it can be a number of starting points, often maybe a food fact. So let's say I'm going to talk about corn. Well, there's all sorts of data I could tell you about corn. Its phylum and its genus and its growing zones and things like that. But if I were going to tell you a story about that, I would try to draw some sort of connection to, maybe the history of corn or people that like corn or why do they grow corn or why do we eat it or maybe even a memory about it. So again, it's sort of adding those narrative details that bring a fact to life and make it resonate with people on a different level.
Yes, I bet that makes it a lot more interesting for people and connects with a lot more people than it would have been if you just stated a fact.
It does, because we all know, or for most of us, even people that are very good at the database things like computer science or math or science, we tend to remember things better in a story format because it sticks with us a little bit more. Even if a story contains a fact, if I were telling you that someone went fishing and they caught the largest fish of their life and it was twice the length of their canoe, that is more memorable than saying the person caught a 9-foot fish. You would just remember that because of the canoe thing. I know that's a silly example, but that really is a very simple story that is conveying a fact in a way that resonates with people better.
Makes sense. Branching off of that question a bit, what is the purpose of food with storytelling and just in general?
Well, I mean, at its most basic, we know this, and you know this. Food is, edible, nutritious substances that we consume as living beings so that we don't die. But it's a lot more interesting than that, or I think that it can be. Not all food situations have stories. But to me, when it's a story, it's again when you make that connection, when people make an association in their mind, where they learn something, where it seems to be more experiential than just consuming food.
Yes, I totally agree. I think many people see food as just something to chow down to give you energy, but it can be so much more than that.
It
Uh,
can be. And, it doesn't have to be story driven for anybody else. I mean, we all have our things where the narrative of it is more interesting, but that's not true for everybody. I mean, if someone wanted to tell me a wonderful narrative about, I don't know, let me make this up, the game of golf, I would listen politely because
yeah.
that's what we do for one another. But I will never be interested in golf stories. That's just not my thing. And I think that's true of food also. But I will say that having told stories about food really my whole life in some ways, and certainly professionally for the last 25 or 30 years, is that other than music, I don't know of anything that tends to land as a story or elicit more stories from people than food, other than music. Those two things, because we tend to remember that in context. If I were to say, what shirt did you wear for Thanksgiving last year? You probably have no idea but you could probably tell me something that was either really good or really bad, or a context of memory from Thanksgiving. Just like we all hear songs, it's like, oh yeah, I remember the first time I heard this song, or oh, that makes me think of my friend Belinda, or oh, something like that. Food can have those same cognitive, emotionally based associations that we all have shared that.
Interesting. So how do you yourself come up with like those associations? How do you get those ideas when you connect storytelling to food? Does it come easy to you, or is it difficult at points?
Sometimes it is as natural as the conversation we're having, where something is so interesting or so evocative or so personal that I'm excited. It's like, I cannot wait to tell you about the popcorn with real butter I had at the movie last week, or I cannot wait to tell you that my daughter's favorite food is this for something. Sometimes when it's a job, quite honestly, I have to really think about, okay, what's going to be the connection here? And in those contexts, it may not be a connection I have, but one that I hope that the reader has, where they read it and I was like, oh, I didn't know that's where coconuts came from, or oh, I didn't know that there was a history of a hummingbird cake that involves coconut that came from this place in Alabama or whatever. So there's generally a story, but they're not necessarily my stories. I always say that sometimes if I can make the reader come up with their own story in their head or make that connection, that when I'm writing professionally for an audience, I'm more interested in helping them figure out what they have to think about a topic than what I have to think about that topic.
That's a super interesting thing to bring up. I like how you are trying to evoke someone else's ideas on this rather than just throwing yours at them. So what got you interested in doing this?
Well, it was not my intention to do this as a career. In some ways, it was inevitable. I always wanted to be a teacher. What I really thought I was going to be was an English teacher, an English professor at a university that wrote novels and short stories on the side. But I also was a person that cooked. And, I seemed to, from a very early age, been a person that noticed that there were correlations between what people and families and communities and countries and so forth ate and other parts of that culture. Like some people would view pottery or art or a music style or something like that as sort of a reflection of culture's preferences and priorities and things like that. For some reason, food struck me that way when I was, a fairly young child, but I didn't start doing anything with that other than like, that's interesting until much later. I was trained as a journalist. I have a degree in journalism. So the writing I was trained in, and I've been a cook my whole life, and decided about 26-ish years ago that I was going to combine the two.
It's really awesome that English teachers are great, of course, but it's awesome that you decided to go with this great passion of yours.
Well, yes, I do think, when one is able, the more you're naturally interested in something you have to do for a job, the better it generally goes.
Definitely. So what do you do when you get stuck? As we both imagine that sometimes certain foods can be particularly hard to connect, but what do you do, and any general life advice that people can do when they also get stuck in life? As I imagine those two things connect a little bit.
Well, that's a really very sophisticated question that has a lot of implications, and I'm not sure I have a story. I think that we all have a work ethic, and sometimes you just got to knock it out. It's like, I do not care about this assignment, and it is still due tomorrow, whether I care about it or not, and I've got to do it. So sometimes it is that. It's just like, this isn't eliciting great passion with me, but it's still due tomorrow. And I think that that's okay. I don't think that everything has to be your best thing ever. You just have to make sure it meets the baseline of what you are willing to put your name on. That's probably not what you were going for, but that's what that's what came to mind.
I definitely agree. As writers, definitely sometimes it's hard. You don't feel like everything you write just doesn't feel right, like it's your best work, but once you get past that point, then you can actually end up doing some of your best writing. But you just have to get past that point, that everything doesn't have to be perfect.
That's true. There's an expression, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I don't know if you've heard some, I'm probably misquoting that, but sometimes doing a good job is a good job. Sometimes doing an excellent job is required, but there is nothing to be ashamed of in doing good work, even if it's not your best work ever. And I think that no matter, well, I don't know if a surgeon should say that, but for certainly what I do, I mean, these are not life and death things. If I write a perfectly good piece, that's fine. And occasionally I write something that either because I'm behind it or resonates with people, it's great. That feels good too. But it doesn't all have to be at the same level.
I'm super glad you gave that advice, because I feel like whenever you ask someone for advice, they're always like, just do your best. And you never hear that it's okay to just do what you have done.
Well, I think, yes, but I also think that doing your best is not a set level. Doing my best on a math problem is going to be very different from doing my best on an essay. Or doing my best when I cook is very different from doing my best if I were to try to attempt something like auto repair or something. I think that our bests are relative things, and that's okay too.
I've never thought of it like that.
I love that perspective. I'm gonna carry that into the new day tomorrow.
Good.
For sure. Yeah. So we'll move on to the next part of the interview, which is kind of about Southern food.
Mm-hmm.
We'll really quickly start. Like, what exactly is Southern food to you? Just because I feel it's such a broad term.
It is.
So
it's kind of like saying American food, because there is no one Southern food. There are many, many, many Southern foods. When I tell people about it, it's okay. If people have had maybe only one experience with any kind of food, that tends to be your definition. So let's say I were to fly to New York tomorrow. I'm going to stay 3 days. But all I'm going to eat for 3 days are hot dogs out of the hot dog carts on the street corner. So for me, in that context, everything about New York food is a hot dog, but we know that that's not all there is to it. So I think sometimes when people have only one or maybe one category of experience, they tend to extrapolate and think that's what the whole thing's about. And we know that's not true. So even though I can't say definitively, even though I've been trying to encapsulate it for years now, what is Southern food, I'll tell you some things that do seem to be at least generally applicable across the board. One thing is that it is a very individual thing. That the South, if you look at the culinary landscape and the culinary topographical map, if I can mix metaphors, of the United States, you're going to get more diversity, more points of origin, and more differences in the American South than you're going to get in most other regions, because so many different kinds of people have come here from so many different places. And so it really is, there are many, many, many ways to be authentically Southern and be completely different from the way they do it in another part of the South. In addition to the people, there is traditionally, at least, and it's some extends to now too, the role of place. So Charleston, South Carolina, very famous Southern city. It's on the Atlantic Ocean. That being on the ocean really informs what they consider to be Southern food. Nashville, Tennessee, another really famous Southern place, is in Middle Tennessee, almost in the Mississippi River. Their authentic Southern is different. Asheville, it's in the mountains. So when you start thinking about all of the places with whom no one would argue that those are iconic Southern spots, that see how different the way the food would be there because of their geography and the people who have lived there and how long it's been there. Southern food isn't one thing, it's a bunch of map dots. Do you guys know the artwork of Georges Seurat, pointillism? Do you know what I mean? It's one of those paintings in a museum that if you get up close to it, all you see are a bunch of dots, but if you back up, it looks like a total image. That's the way I think about Southern food. If you back up, it looks like one thing, but the closer you get, you see there are all these little dots coming together to make it.
That's an amazing analogy. Wow. I never thought of it that way. I feel like lots of different cuisines of food can kind of sometimes be like that too. Absolutely. Where it's just one dot. So kind of going off of that idea, how do we find that big picture? How do we broaden people's perspectives on not just Southern foods, but other different types of food? How do we see that big picture rather than the individual dots?
That's where the story comes in. It really is. This is what I do when the story comes in. Because if the three of us were to each describe our favorite food, it's probably very different foods, but we understand how it feels to have a favorite food. We understand that passion, that excitement, how delicious it is, how happy it makes us, how great it is if someone who loves us makes it for us, how we feel when we share it with a friend. So even though the foods are completely different, the story about our common enjoyment, how we approach that, is very similar. And that's why I think food stories are so compelling.
Wow, that's great. And I love that connection that we were able to find even between the interview, between finding those pictures and how that connects to storytelling.
Right.
Really great.
I can tell you that if you're ever stuck with someone that you maybe don't know what you're going to chat about, you need to kill time with them, or you're stuck in an airport with them or something like that, if you want to start just a generally interesting conversation, ask them about what their favorite food is. It opens up. It is a great icebreaker. So not just because I do that for a living, but I can tell you, it really, people are that are very reticent otherwise are very excited to tell you about something that is important to them.
I love that, because everyone's always like, talk about the weather or something. So that's,
we can bridge that, say, given the rain, how are your tomatoes or whatever.
I love that. So kind of concluding this section, what's your favorite Southern style in your Southern style food?
My Southern style is both very contemporary and also goes back to the earliest dates of the cuisines that come together that we now call Southern cuisine. And that is anything out of a garden. I love things from farmers markets and produce. And again, considering all the individualities that we've talked about, traditional Southern cuisine is deeply agrarian, which can sometimes surprise people because we know things like barbecue and fried chicken and all get a lot of attention. But traditionally, it was locally grown seasonal produce. And that remains my absolute favorite thing to cook. I mean, take me to a farmer's market and I am as happy as if I were in, MoMA or something like that. I love that.
So do you have a favorite particular Southern dish that you really enjoy making and eating?
Wow, that's a great question. And given I've written many, many books on the topic, you would think so. I think it would vary with the seasons, because what I'm excited about around Halloween is not going to be what I'm excited about for the 4th of July. I think that I would say that my favorite thing to cook is whatever is best in the garden on that day. And by garden, I don't mean necessarily my garden, because I live in the woods with like 10,000 deer. I can't grow anything. But if I were to go to the farmer's market or a grocery store, something like that, whatever is the best that day is my favorite that day. I will also say I'm really, really good at pots of soup. I can make great soup. I can make a killer pound cake. And I'm quite good at technical French sauces of all things.
Sounds delicious. Making me hungry.
It can be.
I guess, do you have anything else to add for the interview in general?
No, I would just say that I believe that everybody deserves a story. I think that stories sometimes can sound really stilted, like, we all think, oh God, I couldn't write a book or couldn't something. Stories don't have to be that thought out or that big. Stories can be a great conversation. I mean, can be a story. And I think that we all deserve our stories, that sometimes we can say, oh, I've not done anything that important, or who cares what my favorite food is, or who cares what my grandmother used to make for me. That's not true. I think that we each deserve our own food stories. And it is as important a part of our family tree as our actual relatives. I think that context, sometimes I tell my daughter, who's now a grown woman and she happens to live in a foreign country, and you talk about understanding the role of food. When you suddenly live in a place where you can't get the food you've grown up with, that starts feeding into identity and homesickness and longing and all that sort of stuff. But I think that sometimes I say, this is what I eat because this is who I am, and not to over romanticize that, but that's true. And I think that every single person has a human right to good, nutritious, safe, clean food. And I believe that each person deserves to be able to tell their story about that. It's a part of human dignity.
Thank you for leaving us with that really, really great ideas.